Welcome to the Bear Market Brief. I'm your host, Aaron. We're now nearly at the 1-year anniversary of the Ukraine war, and as such, I wanted to devote some coverage to it. Less on the tactics and strategy, there's some great coverage out there, including from FPRI, but more on the bigger picture and personal narrative. What is this like for the people involved? I'm hoping to devote a couple of episodes to this, but up first is Maria Romanenko, who was a journalist in Ukraine, at least until the war. She'll tell you a little bit more about what she's doing now. We spoke about her personal experience with the war, but also looking back after a year, the bigger picture. How does she think about the war? What does it make her feel? This is, of course, just one story, but it's nonetheless an important one to tell. At the request of Maria, proceeds from today's episode will be donated to Boris Dedov, an artist putting together a museum in Chernihiv about atrocities that occurred there during Russian occupation. I'm including in the description a Twitter thread that Maria wrote explaining the project in a little bit better detail, and I also asked her a question about it at the end of the episode. In any case, I hope you consider donating. That said, let's dive in. Maria, thank you for joining today.
Thank you for having me, Aaron.
So let's start with a basic introduction. What are you doing now, and what were you doing before the war?
So I've been a journalist since 2016. I'm worked as a journalist in Ukraine. I was since 2017, 2018. I've been working for Romanenko International for a couple of years, being the chief editor, and that's like. At the time, it was the largest multimedia English language media outlet in Ukraine. And as for now, on a day-to-day, all I do is help Ukrainians in Greater Manchester area, where I am now, whether that is through translation or giving free walking tours of Manchester for new arrivals. And I have done that for over 400 Ukrainians now. But at the moment, my partner and I, we fled together last year because he's British and he wanted to get back to the UK. So Jez and I, we are now in the process of this 4-stage plan for the return. And the first one is we're both writing a book called Escape from Ukraine. And it basically tells the story of how we got out, because the story for us, in our case, because it was in the very first days, that involved many, many hours of queuing at the border and seeing some horrific scenes of death and people fainting and people feeling sick. And all in all, our journey from Ukraine to the UK took 7 days, and that included a lot of fighting bureaucracy, specifically in the UK. So we're doing the book about that, and the second stage is we setting up a CIC, or community interest company, called Talks for Ukraine, where we tell the story of the above and show a lot of photographs that we took along the way. And this will be rolled out to schools, community groups, businesses, bands, festivals over the next few months. And the third one is a documentary that we're working on, and it's called Return to Ukraine. So this will be when Ukraine is free, when Ukraine wins. We will make a documentary of our return, but that won't really be about us. It'll be more about reunions and, me reuniting with my friends, my family, but also talking to people who have decided to stay, who stayed all this time, and people who decided to leave, asking them why they did it, and also talking to politicians and notable people, asking about what Ukraine needs now for the restoration, which we know will take a long time. And the final stage is Invest in Ukraine, and that will be a company that will help British businesses invest in Ukraine again after victory and support them in this process. So this is what I've been doing here since arriving in Manchester last year.
That sounds like a busy schedule and a very ambitious plan. So I wish you the best of luck with that. You mentioned your journey out of Ukraine at the beginning of the war. So why don't we talk about that a little bit? Let's start on day one. Where were you on February 24th when the news came? Was Russia's invasion something you were expecting? Had you been talking about it? Had you made plans for it?
Well, I think like most Ukrainians, I thought that maybe something would happen, but I didn't imagine it at the scale that it happened. I don't think anybody did, including the president. It was definitely something that none of us anticipated. So I watched just before I was in Poland, but since the 23rd of February, I was back in Ukraine. So on the 21st of February, I watched Putin's crazy speech, and where he basically, recognized the independence of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions in Ukraine. And I sort of laughed at it. It was a bit crazy and scary because, you don't want a nuclear state to say that the leader of a nuclear state to come up with this claims that Ukraine is not a real country and it was invented by Lenin and all of the stuff that he said on the 21st of February. But I watched it and I was like, well, it's just a madman, and he'll probably be happy with, that he did this thing now and then he might do something in the future. But I definitely didn't expect it to all happen at once the way everything did. So that's why on February 23rd, I flew back to Ukraine after spending a week in Poland. The main reason for going to Poland was to just meet up with my boyfriend because he wouldn't come to Ukraine because of the advice of the UK government they advised against going to Ukraine. Basically, any trips to Ukraine, they said that they advised against it. So I decided to fly back, and that again was my sort of feeling that even if something happens, I'm in my own country. And I didn't anticipate things to happen the way they did. But on the 24th of February, we woke up in the Kiev region. We were staying with my dad, and my partner woke me up saying that there's bombs being dropped everywhere. And I initially just couldn't really struggle to understand what was going on. It was hard to believe it. And then he was like, well, I'm getting out of the country, regardless of what you decide to do. But if you're planning to come with me, you need to act really quickly because I'm going now. So I had this very, very serious dilemma of whether I follow him and potentially say goodbye to my family, potentially forever. I wouldn't know if I left when I would see them again, and whether I'd be able to see them. You never really know what happens. If Putin's plan was to take over Ukraine in 3 days, and as much as everybody says that it's not possible and it sounds crazy, in the first couple of days, things developed so fast, and I think nobody really knew what was going to happen. The first couple of days definitely were really, really scary for most Ukrainians. So if Putin had his thing, none of us knew whether we would see each other again. So or whether to stay in Ukraine and then not to see my partner again, potentially, because again, I wouldn't know if there would be any transport means to go outside of Ukraine if I stayed. So I just decided to go with him at least to Lviv, which is where he was going. My dad drove us. The journey took us 10 hours, and we just saw lots of cars, heading towards Lviv, but in the other direction towards eastwards, Ukrainian tanks and other military vehicles. It was kind of like seeing the Independence Day parade, but realizing that it's all real, and those tanks are not just there to show off, but they actually go into a real war. So we got to Lviv. That was already the night of 24th, and we stayed there for a couple of hours. And our friend, my partner's friend, agreed to put us up and also to drive us to the border the next day. And we actually got going at 4 a.m. But before that, we heard a fighter jet in the sky, and we all went down to a bomb shelter and stayed there for some time until I decided to get up a little bit, go upstairs and get some signal. And I actually saw that the plane was showing up on flight radar for some reason, and it was a Ukrainian, a friendly plane. So after that, we left at 4 a.m. and went to the border. The journey to the border was supposed to take us, normally it takes 1 hour, 15 minutes. Google Maps was telling us that it'd be 1 hour, 40 minutes. And we were like, well, that's fine. We'll be there before breakfast, cross the border by lunchtime. And, it's all going to be easy and nice. But then 19 kilometers before the actual border, the traffic just stood still. No cars were moving at all. It was initially like a single lane road, but it turned into 2 lanes and then 3 lanes and then 4 lanes by people just using the side roads and the dirt tracks and things like that. So it just was like a weird thing to see. You just stuck there, and then daylight came, the sun, the sunrise came, and we just saw like lots of women abandoning the cars where their husbands were, taking the buggy, taking the child, and taking whatever they could put in plastic bags to carry to the border and walk for 19 kilometers to the border with their children and their bags. And it was a very strange thing to see. It's definitely something you never forget. But also on the way to the border, I was giving out lots of interviews because I was probably one of the first people to cross the border, and definitely one of the first people who spoke English well and had a bit of a profile that journalists actually had access to. So that's why I ended up like on the 10-hour journey to Lviv. I did like 8 hours of straight back-to-back interviews, and I talked to pretty much every single BBC platform and everywhere else, especially in the UK, The Guardian, ITV. Where I just did that, so many interviews. That was crazy.
In that moment, how would you describe how you were feeling? Were you scared, stressed? I can certainly imagine. What was going through your head at that moment?
I think maybe because I was doing all the interviews, I didn't really have time to catch up with my feelings. I was just repeating the same thing to everybody and like saying that this is what I'm doing, this is what I'm seeing. It's horrible what's going on. I didn't expect it, but it's kind of like every interview was pretty much the same thing. And if you ask me now, or if I had to watch all of those interviews now, I did so many of them probably just an autopilot, and it was like repeating the same things. So I think doing all those interviews kind of took my mind off what was happening, and which probably was good for that time, but that also meant that I had a very delayed full scale realization of what happened. That only happened like 7-8 days later in the UK when we were getting a dinner, and that was the first time we like sat down, and my partner showed to me a video of Borodyanka in the Kiev region, and it was like fully destroyed, and I just broke down in tears, and it hit me really hard. So I think the first 8 days, because we were doing so many things, we were constantly on the move, and we were doing lots of interviews and talking a lot about what we went through, that I couldn't really fully understand what we did and how lucky we were to, despite all the horror that we faced and despite being 23 hours spending on food, without toilet access, without access to any food or water, just nearly crushed to death, where we saw some horrific scenes, as I said. Despite all of that, I think we were really, really, despite what we saw, I think we were really, really lucky to be able to cross the border practically, unharmed, other than getting like back pain and leg pain from all the standing in one piece. And with all our belongings, we saw many people losing their bags, and my partner nearly lost our suitcase, because in that crash, you just, if you let go of something, there's pretty much no chance of you finding it again, because there's such a big crowd that you can't like walk around. Just wherever you squeezed into, wherever, that's where you stay in. We were, it was a crazy journey out, and there's so much that happened. We also met we talked to some very interesting and nice people. We saw different things happening. It's not just our story, but it's the stories of other people who were leaving. There was a woman with a French bulldog who just couldn't. She was carrying her dog, but she also had a suitcase, and she had to choose between her dog and the suitcase because she just couldn't do it with both. So she let go of her suitcase, carry on her dog, and there's stories like that we saw. And there's also what we saw on the other side when we finally crossed 40 hours later, since starting in the Kiev region, we finally crossed into Poland, and we were welcomed by an army of volunteers who everybody was just trying to help and do something. And that was the first time we saw like food, the first time, in 40 hours. And that was the first time I saw toilet facilities, and I was given this like coffee, and it was like instant coffee, the cheapest kind of coffee that you can get, but it tasted divine. And then we sat down, and there were people like offering to drive you anywhere to different cities, offering to put you up in different cities. And two Ukrainian guys who have been living in Poland for some time, they drove us to Krakow. And we sat down in the car, and it was, again, there was nothing special about that car, but as soon as we sat down in the car, we were like, oh my God, this is like so comfortable. So you just become so grateful for everything you see. And, there's so many aspects of our escapes that's why we decided to do a book about this, because as many interviews as we did throughout this time, you normally just squeeze it into a 3-minute like TV segment, and the questions would be pretty much the same, and you don't get to tell all those interesting stories of what we saw.
So one of the things I've heard about during the war, both in another interview I did for this podcast, but in general, are stories of solidarity between Ukrainians and looking out for each other. Is that something you experienced in the rush to get out of the country at all?
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely a lot of helping each other. I mean, I had as well as it being like physically and morally difficult, the border journey, I also started my period at the same time, which meant that I just was feeling very, very sick. And at one point, I thought that if I don't get out of the crash, I'd just die. So I had to like push through and push forward and to get out to the next bit, which was, so the first bit was basically like this, like we refer to it as death pit now, because it was just like a fenced area that was probably made for 50 people tops, but there were like thousands of people all just trying to get through. And once you get through this fenced, this cage area, which I think is only just to filter people through, because there's 2 single-person gates in there, and they let out people at the rate of like 1 person a minute. So that's why there was such a crash, because they only let out 1 person, and they wait some time, and then another one. And once you get through that, you're in another queue, and that queue is now for the Polish side of the border. And then the next stage is, the Ukrainian side of the border. And then the next stage is the Polish side of the border, which was super quick. It was basically the first 2 stages that were taking so much time. So in the first area, as I said, I was feeling so sick, and at first I tried to fight it, and I had some paracetamol, but I didn't have any water, or at least I couldn't get any water because you just couldn't move. And a lady passed on her water bottle to me so that I could take some water. And then there were lots of mothers with children, and they were really, really understandably, they were really, really worried about their children being crushed to death. And also there were things like, not being able to give food, or not even having enough food, because nobody planned for this to be like a 20 plus hour thing. And a lot of them like tried to ask for them to be let out first and to be given priority. And when I said that I was like feeling that if I stay here for any longer, that I would possibly not be alive, I joined a group of women that were pushing through. And I saw that there were like kind of looks at me that, because everybody was just trying to make sure that everything is fair, that so I anticipated people would be looking at me like, why are you going? You clearly haven't got a child in your arm. But then as soon as people saw like that I was looking very pale, and that I was really just not had much life in me left if I was staying there, they all kind of understood, and everybody was kind. And then as we got to the next stage, there were people setting up this makeshift toilets for children, so that at least children could go to the toilets. We couldn't, especially women couldn't go. So it's easy if you're a man, you can just go and turn your back to everybody and do the thing. But, if you're a woman, you literally 23 hours, you can't use the toilet at all because there were no toilets. So at least for children, they were setting up makeshift toilets, and somebody was doing some sort of yoga thing, I think, so that people could stretch a little bit. And there was this also incredible thing that every couple of hours there were somebody coming from the Polish side and bringing some Polish food for people, so like biscuits. So there was looking after each other from coming from different sides, different people. But then the other thing is that even if you have food at the Ukrainian side, you don't want to eat because, as I said, there's no there's no toilet facilities, so you just don't really dare to eat in case you will need the toilet after that. So, but yeah, we saw a lot of kindness, especially in Poland. And it also came from Ukrainians, because a lot of those people who were offering free rides and free accommodation, they were Ukrainians who have settled in some time ago. But Ukrainians were looking after each other as well. Certainly, there was a lot of advocacy for mothers with children, and sort of asking for them for people to look after them.
So what happened next? Tell me about how you got into the UK. You said there were some bureaucratic hurdles.
Oh yeah, I mean there were many bureaucratic hurdles. So this was so we finally crossed into Poland on February 26th. It was 10 a.m. And the first thing, well, we're planning to go to Warsaw first, and we even had, so my friend, I went to university in England, University of Leeds. So I had a Polish friend from there who messaged me, and lots of people were messaging me, to be honest. I had so many different like kind messages all over social media, like offering any help, like lots of Polish people saying, well, if you come to Poznan or if you come to here, you're welcome in my house, or I can help you with anything else. So that friend was one of the people who reached out, and we initially were going to go to Warsaw to stay with him. And he even bought us train tickets, but the train tickets were like for 6:30, and there was so much like overlooking and like having like wishful thinking, like, oh, we can get that train at 6:30 a.m. and then it's like already 6 o'clock and you're nowhere near to crossing, and then it's like 7, 8, and you're like, right, yeah, that was definitely wishful thinking. So when we crossed at 10 o'clock, we decided to go to Krakow first instead, and stay there for 2 nights. And then the second, after that, we went to Warsaw and stayed with a friend. And whilst we were in Warsaw, and the main reason we went to Warsaw is because the British Embassy is in Warsaw. And so when we were in Warsaw, we had it there, and they wouldn't even talk to me because I don't have a British passport. And there were other Ukrainians just turning up to the embassy and asking for help. And they were just all turned down and like said, you have to go to the visa center or the consulate. And there were like a couple of other places that they were being redirected to. But the thing with those places is that they had very limited opening hours, or they had no slots to be seen. So everybody was so confused what to do. And if you don't have a British passport, you won't even get any help. So, but my partner does. And he was like, well, you can't turn me down, I have my British passport. And so they talked to him, and he was like, well, the other thing is that I was supposed to have a tourist visa for the UK because I applied in early February. That's what they advised to partners of British residents. They held this talk on Zoom early February, or like closer to mid-February, and they said to them that your best bet is for your partners to apply for a tourist visa, and we will expedite them. We will ensure that these are processed quickly. And that's what I did. I applied, although before that call, because I actually sort of did this earlier, but the advice was actually the same what I did. So I applied for a tourist visa, I think around 6th of February or 8th of February. And normally they process those in 1-2 weeks, and then you get your visa, and happy days, you can come to the UK. But when the full-scale war started, I still haven't heard back from the embassy, from the visa application center. The good thing was that I decided to hold on to my passport, which was probably one of the best decisions, because if I didn't have my passport in all those circumstances, I don't know how I would have done all of this. So we still didn't hear back, and we tried to get the help of my partner's MP and ask, can you look into this? What's going on with my visa? Why have I not heard back? And then when we were at the British Embassy, the main thing we tried to find out is, where's my visa? What happened to it? Why have I not heard about it? And somehow we actually then heard that I did get the visa, but they just don't know where they sent it to, because normally the visa application center is in Kiev, but straight after the bomb started dropping, they closed that down and they stopped the issuance of tourist visas. And they had like a skeleton team in Lviv. And they were like, well, we gave you a visa, but we don't know where we sent it. It might have been sent to Kiev, to the center that's closed down. It might have been sent to Lviv. It might be in Poland. We don't know, and we have no means of finding out. And we were like, okay, well, what am I supposed to do? Can you reissue it? No, we can't reissue visas. Okay, well, what am I supposed to do? Well, you have to reapply. I was like, but how can I reapply for a tourist visa when you close those down for Ukrainians because of the war? And they're like, we don't know. And so that was, quite useless. And my partner was basically just trying to find out how to deal with this. And at the same time, by complete coincidence, Boris Johnson, the Prime Minister at the time, and Liz Truss, who was Foreign Secretary at the time, were visiting the British Embassy for a press conference. So that's why my partner was like told, can you come back in 40 minutes? And he was like, why? What's going on? And then he found out what happened, and it's because of the visit. And he was like, well, I'm not coming back, even better. I'm staying here so that we can find out what happened to the visa. And we just basically started calling, or my partner started calling all the media organizations that we talked to before, all the UK-based ones, and asking them to help and to give a call to the Home Office and ask them what happened to my visa and how I can get into the country, because my partner's got a home in the UK. He's wanted to go to the UK, but he's not going to leave me. And that leaves us in an awkward position where we have no means of getting to the UK for however long, and staying in Poland would be expensive for us and it'd be difficult. And we just really just want to go home after everything we lived through. So after all the media calls, my partner gets sort of called in and said, we're going to try and give you this thing that's called a visa waiver. And basically a visa waiver is like this special, and again, this was all before all the schemes were announced. So this was early March, and I think this was 1st of March, and Homes for Ukraine was opened on, I think, 16th or 17th of March. And then the family visa, even though it existed at the time, it wasn't extended to, at that time it was only open to like spouses and people who lived together for 2 years. But because I was based in Kiev and my partner was based in Manchester, coming to Kiev every month, we didn't really, we weren't eligible for that. So they told us they try and sort out the visa waiver, and that is like a permission to board a specific flight and then to be let into the country. And so we got excited. We chose a flight to Manchester, from Krakow to Manchester, showed it to them, sent it to them. And after another hour or so, they call back and they say, Maria's been granted a visa waiver. And that was like a very, the visa waiver is a very, very rare thing, and it happens. It's given out very, very rarely, and we think I was only given that because of the pressure that we were able to put on the Home Office. And I realized completely that, it's another aspect where I can say that we were so lucky, because most, probably every other Ukrainian that was doing the journey didn't have this support and didn't have this leverage that they could use. So I got the visa waiver. But even with that, I went to the airport and the Ryanair staff was like, where's your visa? And I'm like, well, I have a visa waiver. And they were like, okay, well, where is it? Can you show me a piece of paper that says that you've got one? And I was like, no, there's no piece of paper. It's something you have in your system. And we were like, have you got an email about this? And I was like, no, it's in your system. No, there's nothing in our system. And we were like, just as we were about to call the embassy and ask what's going on, her colleague comes up to her and says, oh yeah, there was somebody with a visa waiver. Try checking this other system. And they're like, oh yeah, you are on it. And so we were allowed to board. But then as I arrive in the UK, again, a similar thing, they asked me if I've got the visa, and I say I've got the visa waiver. And it turns out that even though you've got the visa waiver, it doesn't mean automatic entry into the country. They have to email the Home Office and ask them, like, if they allow me to enter the country. And then only after they hear back, they are allowed to do it. And that obviously can take time. And for me, it took 2.5 hours for them to allow me to enter the country. And whilst we were waiting for this 2.5 hours, they officially detained me at the border and put me in this kind of on the bench, and then they say send counterterrorism police for me to check I wasn't a terrorist. And with all of that, it was basically quite a difficult journey in, and it wasn't helped by the fact that the UK didn't prepare for this sufficiently and didn't act fast enough. It took them only a couple of weeks to act, and which I'm very grateful that they did. And that meant that also after a couple of weeks, they extended the family scheme to engaged couples. So we were able to apply, and that's how I've legalized myself fully in the country, and I'm now on a family visa. But it definitely took a lot of stress and energy, and that's something you don't really want after that horrific story that we went through by crossing the border.
I was going to say I can imagine, but honestly, I don't think I really can imagine. So that's really a heck of a story. Let's switch gears a little bit because we're recording this. It's now almost the year anniversary of the war. So I want to look back, ask about some bigger questions, and I guess we'll start with maybe the biggest one personally. Are you the same person you were a year ago?
No, well, I don't think any of Ukrainians are the same people. I mean, we lived with the war actually since 2014, and that affected us to some extent, but not to most of us. Still weren't affected as much as we were now since last year. And I'm sure that all of us, or the vast majority of us, wake up every morning and the first thing we do is check what's been bombed. And if all our relatives are okay and alive, if all our friends are okay and alive, and every morning since February 24th has been starting like this. And well, secondly, I mean, other things have changed, and that's, I think there was a thing where before 2022, I was trying to think that to speak to some Russians was okay. And, I obviously despised the government since 2014 and for everything they've done against Ukrainians for such a long time. But in general, I carried on to talking to my friends who were Russian but living outside of Russia. And that's definitely become more difficult since February last year. And I've just decided not to talk to any of them because I just find that even the most liberal Russians, once you approach certain subjects such as Crimea, they will, for example, completely support Ukraine in the last year because of, they'll think that it was an unjust attack on Ukraine. But when you talk to them about Crimea, they're like, oh, but Crimea is a different issue. Crimea should have been returned to Russia because it was Russian during this time. And that's not something these are not conversations that I can tolerate anymore. And I just prefer to put my energy elsewhere rather than argue with Russians about different subjects. And there's definitely this one thing that most of them do is that they think that they have a say in what Ukraine should do and what Ukraine should have done and what Ukraine should do and what's the best future for Ukraine. And it's just like, no, if you use the principle that Ukraine has been under Russia for during Soviet time and then under Russia during Russian Empire time, then you can use the same principle that, well, why don't Lithuanians tell Ukrainians what to do? Ukraine was under Lithuania for a very long time as well. Or why don't Polish people tell Ukraine what to do? It's just, it's a completely different mindset that they have. And it's been hard for me to deal with that in the last year. I just prefer to talk to people who completely support Ukraine. And I'm very lucky to be in the UK because people here are very supportive.
Now, another question. You had mentioned you went to school in the UK. So did you face much of a cultural adjustment to being in the UK, or was that relatively smooth for you?
No, that was relatively smooth. So again, I'm lucky. I'm not sure I would have ever done this journey. I'm not sure I would have left Ukraine if I didn't have a British partner. So that, and I was also like, and the other thing, so I'm lucky that I have him here and I have somewhere to live and I don't have to worry about all those things. But I'm also lucky that I lived in the UK before and I went to school and university here, and that means that I'm fluent in English and that I've already lived here. I already know most of the aspects of British life, and there wasn't a lot of adjustment to do for a lot of Ukrainians. It was a lot of things that they had to set up, but I was already aware of all of this, and I didn't have to do so much settling in and as they did. And that's why I realize in this luck and privilege that I've been doing the free walking tours of Manchester in Ukrainian, because that was my way to give back and help others. And that's why I've been translating and interpreting. I got a formal qualification as an interpreter, just to be able to help other Ukrainians settle in, because for them it's a completely different story. They come to a country where they've never been, most of them. They don't speak the language of, they don't have anybody to rely on, especially at first. So I'm in a much more fortunate position, and I try not to take it for granted, but actually use that to help others. And I'm very grateful that I also have a lot of platforms where I can advocate Ukrainians' needs and talk about Ukraine and give back to the community.
So let's talk about that community on a broader level here. So, what are the kind of key issues that Ukrainian refugees in the UK are facing now, and has that set of issues evolved over the last year?
Yes, definitely. I think because most of the Ukrainians who have arrived into the UK, they arrived in the first couple of months of the scheme. So meaning in March, April, a lot of them came over summer. But then after that, we've seen a significant fall in people. And that's mostly to do with the fact that the UK has sort of almost run out of hosts who could host. And a lot of people who wanted to host, they changed their mind because of the cost of living crisis, or because of hearing some stories of relationships that broke down. And there's definitely been a lot fewer Ukrainians coming recently. So in the first months when they were arriving, it was basically just everyday items like food, water, clothing, washing facilities, baby items, and they were donated in abundance. There were lots of things set up, like free shops for Ukrainians, where they could just come and grab some items completely for free. And it's worth saying that I don't like the term refugees, because it's not completely reflects what Ukrainians are. Refugees are normally people who come to relocate completely, and they leave their homes and they're not able to go back. But most of Ukrainians, if you talk to them, you find out that 95% of them want to go back to Ukraine after they're able to. And a lot of them actually just come for a couple of months or just come for the winter, because winters are very hard to survive in Ukraine now with all the power cuts, and they're planning to go back. But a lot of them are planning to go back once it's safe to go back. So, and even by legal definitions, Ukrainians who come to the UK, they are not refugees because they come on visas. The visa is for 3 years, and they're here on visas.
What
Now,
term do you use?
well, I say war refugees because it that's the best way for people to understand what you're talking about. And war refugees, they escape in the war, but I mean evacuees. You can say evacuees, but you can say war refugees. It's just not correct. But as long as you realize that the issue is actually much more complicated, and they not by legal means they're not refugees. Right now, the needs of Ukrainians who have arrived in the UK, they are mostly to do with housing and finding jobs. A lot of the people, a lot of Ukrainians would have come on the Homes for Ukraine scheme, meaning they stayed with sponsors, with like families or people, British people, or people who have the right to live in the UK, who opened up their homes to them. But most of this, in my experience of talking to people, would have come to an end within like 6 months, because initially the host kind of committed to 6 months, even though it wasn't legally binding. But most people said, well, we'll let you stay for 6 months, and after that you have to stand on your 2 feet and find your own means of living in this country. And in my experience of talking to people, most Ukrainians did have to move out after about 6 months, sometimes 7, 8 months, but normally wouldn't go to a whole year. So these Ukrainians would then, especially if their relationship breaks down suddenly, they would then have to find housing to stay in the UK. And most of them would not be able to afford housing or get housing because there's a housing crisis in the UK, and even for British people to get housing, it's difficult. But especially it's difficult when you don't have a guarantor, so somebody who can guarantee that you'll be paying rent. And if you don't have a history of renting in the UK, and the Ukrainians who are here, obviously they don't have that. And social housing, even though it does exist in the UK on paper, but there's no social housing available for anyone, and the queues to get that can sometimes take decades. So there's, in specific regions, there's people helping with this and talking to private landlords, trying to convince them that they rent out their property to Ukrainians through the benefit system. So basically, when the government, instead of the Ukrainian paying the landlord, the government will cover that cost as part of their benefit system because they receive benefits there. There are a lot of job-related issues because a lot of these Ukrainians who come from Ukraine, they've been doctors, lawyers in Ukraine, and they come here and their qualification is not recognized here, and their language skills are not enough to work in those professions. So they have to work as cleaners, they have to work at warehouses, factories, and whilst they do that, they don't really, because these are difficult jobs. Normally you have to work 12-hour shifts, and you don't have the energy to actually to look anywhere else or to improve your English to find another job. So there's a lot of job related issues for almost everybody, unless they were IT specialists in Ukraine. We found that everybody who's come from an IT sector in Ukraine are able to find jobs here within pretty much hours. They sent out their CV and straight away they're invited for an interview and grabbed, the first, the companies are so happy to have this Ukrainian specialists because Ukraine has got a very high level of IT industry. There's a lot of cultural difficulties because as with most countries, you'll find that people have different things and used to different things. For example, in Ukraine, children normally don't really have sleep time, set hours when they're supposed to be in bed for. A lot of them just stay awake whilst the parents stay awake, and they only will go to bed closer to when the parents go to bed. Here in the UK, children go to bed at 7 p.m. or 8 p.m. And when the family comes to stay with an English family and both have children, it just doesn't work because the other children ask why are they allowed to stay up and we have to go to bed. So that's, I think, been difficult for some relationships. And then the other thing is, as I said, most Ukrainians want to go back to Ukraine, and that makes living in the UK difficult. So they find it hard to set up lives here because they live with one foot out of the door. So they can't fully commit to living in the UK, and that's something that I think is also difficult with the relationship with the families that they live in, because the families, the hosts, expect them to be very active in setting up their life, attending classes that will allow them to find a job, getting a job quickly, moving in somewhere else. But a lot of Ukrainians, because they keep thinking that they'll be going back soon, and nobody knows when all of them are able to go back. But living with that sort of mindset that, well, I'll be able to go back soon. There's no rush for me to do all of these things. But then this timeline keeps being brought forward and forward, and sort of delay. You keep thinking that you'll be able to go back in a couple of months, but then after that you're like, okay, well, it's another couple of months, and then it just means that they are not able to set up their lives. I think that probably are the main ones, that the main difficulties and needs that I've noticed Ukrainians to have.
So turning to the big picture about the war as a whole, I have to notice when you were talking about this earlier, you didn't say when the war ends, you said when Ukraine wins. So A year in, would you say you're optimistic about the outcome?
Yeah, I'm definitely optimistic. I know that Ukrainians won't give up and whatever that takes, and the Russians might do a lot more damage in the coming months and plan to do a lot more damage. But that doesn't mean that the resolve of Ukrainians will go. I think that Ukraine will keep fighting until victory, and I'm certain that that won't change. It's just a matter of how much damage Russia will be able to do in this meantime. But the main, I think, thing is for Ukraine's victory is for the West to keep supporting Ukraine, and because we all know that had the West, I'm very very grateful for how the West has been supporting Ukraine and for everything that they've done to help Ukraine fight Russia. But had the West given all the weapons and all the ammunition that Ukraine asked for in the first days, then we wouldn't be here 1 year later or nearly 1 year later. So Ukraine's victories, Ukraine is definitely going to win, but it's a matter of when, and I think that can be accelerated if the West amps up its support.
And for our penultimate question, a year into this war, what does it mean to you to be Ukrainian?
Um, well, I think being Ukrainian is a lot to do. We have our identity, we have our culture, and we have a lot of history that actually precedes Russian history. And I think being Ukrainian is about defending our history and our identity and culture. And for many, many centuries, Russia tried to stop us doing that and to destroy all of this by changing the history. And it's still happening now. That Putin speech that I referred to on 21st of February, he pretended that Ukraine was only created in 1922 by Lenin. And it's like this, and that happened before when Catherine the Great Catherine II tried to change and rewrite the Ukrainian history, making Ukrainians as something as just like this Russians who have suddenly decided to devolve from being Russian. But if you look at the history, you'll see that Ukrainians date back to the 5th century, and Kiev dates back to the 5th century, and then the Kievan Rus was built for centuries and was this like very flourishing sort of center around which the culture and the trade was being built. And then Moscow was actually built by a Kievan prince, and so all of this culture has been nurtured for centuries, and we had a lot of fighting with other countries and other states that tried to take over Ukraine, and that wasn't just Moscow. That was the Ottoman Republic, that was Poles, Lithuanians, and we've been trying to protect and defend our independence and our culture and our identity. And sadly, in 2023, we're still doing this, but I think being Ukrainian is about freedom and independence, and telling everybody that we're a freedom-loving people, and we want to just live in peace. And had that not been for Moscow's invasion, we would be doing that. And this war is it's not something where you can look at two sides and say, well, what's Ukrainian side and what's Russian side doing? It's an absolute genocidal war and terrorism from one country, and it's a one-sided war. It's a clear invasion that Russia has been preparing for decades, and they've been preparing to take over Crimea for way before 2014, and they've been turning Crimea into a military base since their military and full takeover of Crimea that they achieved illegally in 2014, and they turned Crimea into a military base. And had they not done, they wouldn't be able to do the full-scale invasion last year. So there's a lot of things that they've been trying to destroy our identity and our culture and our independence, but we will continue fighting that, everybody in their fields wherever they can. And we certainly, with our work, we continue talking about what's happening and writing about this. And hopefully we'll be able to return to Ukraine. All of us, all of the Ukrainians, I'm sure they'll be able to they all will want to go back to Ukraine when Ukraine wins, and hopefully that will be sooner than later.
Hope so too. Last question. The proceeds for this episode will be donated to charity, and you had a very specific project in mind for a museum documenting the war. Can you spend a minute just talking a little bit about that? You could do a better job than I can.
Yeah, so I wanted the proceeds from this episode to go to a specific museum and a catalog that for this, it's a new museum, and it's in Yahidne in the Chernihiv region, which is in north of Ukraine, and that was occupied by Russians in the early days of the Russian full-scale invasion. And it spent 1 month under occupation, and there is a school in Yahidne where the Russians held 299 adults and 67 kids captive in this tiny room in a school. And there were lots of horror stories from people who were then released, and they talked about what was going on there. And basically, the school was used by the Russians as a cannon fodder to ensure that the headquarters that were nearby weren't targeted by Ukraine, because they were like, well, if there's Ukrainians in this school, then Ukraine surely won't target the headquarters, because the school is just by it. And this is done. The museum is being set up by somebody called Boris Didov, and he is a famous Ukrainian artist who is currently, he has his museum in Chernihiv, and they've done several exhibitions even since February last year, and a lot of those exhibitions were dedicated to Russia's crimes in Ukraine. And he's a fantastic guy. His son is fighting in the armed forces of Ukraine, and he's been helping as he stayed in Ukraine all this time, and he's been helping by he even opened up his museum to host territorial defense forces in the premises, and he was helping Ukraine in everything he can. And right now he wants to build a museum in this village, Yahidne, where he will showcase what happened in the village, because a lot of the stories have not been told, and they were certainly not told by human rights organizations like Amnesty International. And it was only thanks to a lot of Ukrainian journalists who investigated what happened that these crimes have been exposed. And I think by having that museum, especially after Ukraine's victory, people, it can become a tourist destination where people can come and tourists can come and find out what happened. And he is wanting to publish catalogs for this museum, and for that he is raising €6,500, and the catalogs will be in Ukrainian and English. And it's a little bit hard right now to raise funds for something that you kind of can put in it's kind of like culture, because it's a museum, but then it's also important to keep talking about what Russia's doing, and setting up that museum and producing these catalogs in English language is something that will help this. So that's why I'm supporting him and I'm supporting the project.
We'll include a donation link in the description of this episode. Maria, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Thanks again to Maria and to you, listener, for joining. As I said before, we'll have more coverage of the anniversary of the Ukraine war coming up. Don't forget to follow BMB Russia and Eurasia at the Twitter handle @BearMarketBrief. BMB Russia and Eurasia is a project of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, that's FPRI, a nonpartisan think tank based in Philadelphia. For more information on this initiative and many others, be sure to stop by fpri.org. We'll catch you next time.